Begin the endocrine system. Now we're going to look at the glands and hormone actions. So we're going to get into the actual axes and we're going to describe the synthesis and secretion of thyroid hormones and distinguish between direct and permissive actions of thyroid hormones. So let's start by describing the anatomy of the thyroid gland first, so just so we have some context of where it's located. So it is found in the neck, and it is around the first few rings of the trachea, right? The cartilage rings of the trachea, just beneath the larynx. It's a gland that has two separate lobes. So it has a left lobe, right lobe, and it's connected across the middle as well by this sort of central portion called the isthmus. Now, while we can't see this from the anterior perspective, at the back of the gland, we have four parathyroid glands that are embedded into each of the poles of the lobes. So the superior pole, inferior pole of the two lobes have those four parathyroid glands embedded in the posterior aspect. All right. So the thyroid gland is going to release two hormones, T4, which is tetraiodothyronine, also called thyroxine, and T3, which is triiodothyronine. And so T3, T4 are similar in their action and they can be converted across to one another, but they are basically going to go out into the blood and regulate metabolism. So when you think about the thyroid hormone, T3, T4, think about all of the metabolic functions, right? Just regulating how fast the body is metabolizing its energy source. And we'll talk about examples of that. The other hormone released is calcitonin, and calcitonin is released by other types of cells, also in the thyroid gland. And the main function is to regulate blood calcium levels, mainly to decrease those blood calcium levels and to store the calcium into other tissues like the bone, etc. So calcitonin affects calcium, and thyroid hormone T3, T4 affects our rate of metabolism. Let's talk about the makeup of the thyroid gland. So it has these smaller functional units called follicles, and the follicles are lined by follicular cells, which are, again, epithelial cells. Remember, all of our glands, endocrine glands that is, are lined by, well, actually all glands, whether they're exocrine or endocrine, are all lined by epithelial cells. And then inside of these follicles, we have what's called colloid. So the follicular cells, they're going to take this colloid and they're going to turn that stored colloid into active thyroid hormone and release that out into the blood. Now, what is in this colloid? This is made of thyroglobulin. Thyroglobulin is really a protein, but it's also a precursor that the follicular cells can take and turn that into thyroid hormone. It's really a sort of material, raw material that the follicular cells can utilize in order to make the thyroid hormone. We also want to think about the role of iodide, which is the ionized form of iodine that we take in our diet, and that is actively transported from the blood into the colloid. So there's a lot of iodide being stored here that is needed in order to turn this thyroglobulin into thyroid hormone. So both of those components are needed, the iodide as well as the thyroglobulin, and the follicular cells will take that and turn it into thyroid hormone and then release it on the opposite side of the follicle out into the blood vessels that are between these follicles. Let's look at a sort of zoomed in perspective of that. So here's the colloid in the center, or the kind of the lumen of the follicle. Here are the follicular cells that are responsible for taking this raw material and making thyroid hormone from it. And then here are the blood vessels that are in between the follicles where this thyroid hormone can be released. So the follicular cells are going to take TSH, and TSH is coming from the anterior pituitary. That is going to bind to receptors, TSH receptors on the basal surface of these follicular cells. Because it is coupled to a G protein and we have the signaling cascade mechanism, we have a couple steps in the way. right? We talked about some of these steps, our G protein, our amplifier enzyme, our second messenger, which is cyclic AMP here. That is going to encourage protein kinase to uptake a nice big glob of this colloid and turn it into T3 and T4. And what in the way that that is done is by taking iodide and making these residues on the thyroglobulin. So thyroglobulin is sort of a backbone for the thyroid hormone. And then depending on how many iodide residues we put on there, if it's if it's two of those residues, it becomes DIT. If it's one of those residues, it becomes MIT. So if we have two DIT residues or two iodide residues, then we end up with T4. If we have DIT and one MIT, then we end up with T3. So it's really just a matter of how many of those iodide residues are added to that thyroglobulin backbone, which will depend on whether it's T3 or T4. Both have a similar function, similar mechanism of release, and we'll talk about some of their differences when we look at their action in the periphery. So that thyroglobulin and the residues, which is essentially now T3, T4, is uptaken into the cell in the form of this vesicle, and then it's going to be transported to the basolateral surface, from the apical surface down to the basolateral surface, where it can be released into the blood vessels that are laying underneath the membrane of the follicles here. So that is how we can take TSH as sort of the trigger for this process, and then make thyroid hormone from the stored colloid, which is really that thyroglobulin and iodide, and turn that into T3, T4, which will be released into the bloodstream. Let's look at the actions of thyroid hormone. So that because this is a lipophilic hormone, it is similar to steroids in its makeup. So it requires a lot of fat to make these hormones. This is why it's so important to have adequate amount of fats in your diet in order to have good hormone functioning. This is true for most hormones as well. It's going to alter the rate of transcription of mRNA. In other words, it's going to alter the rate by which we can generate proteins from the DNA in our cells. It's going to sort of speed up that rate. One of its important clinical connections is cretinism. So because thyroid hormone is so important in just our general metabolism, if there's insufficient amounts when, let's say a woman is pregnant and she is not having enough iodine in her diet, and she doesn't have enough thyroid hormone being made, which is translating to inefficient thyroid hormone in that fetus, then these infants can be born with cretinism, which is basically a developmental defect. And this can have a whole slew of effects, from cognitive effects and just general disabilities. And so it's really important to have adequate amounts of thyroid hormone, but also secondarily, adequate amounts of iodine and adequate amounts of fat in your diet in order to have adequate thyroid function. Let's talk about some of the calorigenic effects of thyroid hormone. And when I say calorigenic, these are all going to result in a speed up of your metabolic rate, right? Speeding up of your metabolism, or speeding up of the amount of calories that you burn, which is that calorigenic effect. So let's go over these. So increasing the rate of sodium-potassium pump. And by doing that, you do a couple things. One, you make it easier to fire an action potential. You make it easier to recover from an action potential. We talked about the way that the sodium-potassium pump helps to reestablish the resting membrane potential. And so having a faster rate of that makes it easier to have action potentials, which translates to faster muscle contractions, etc., but also easier to recover from those types of events as well. It increases the number and size of mitochondria. Mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell, so it makes it easier to generate that energy. The electron transport chain goes faster. We can use oxygen faster. We can use energy faster by that effect. It increases the oxidative phosphorylation enzyme. So similar effect, just making the release of energy, the use of energy, overall cellular respiration faster and more efficient. It enhances glycogenolysis, proteolysis, lipolysis. These are all mechanisms of breaking down biomolecules to liberate stored energy. So these can happen faster, and we can use those biomolecules to harness energy faster and more efficiently. It promotes gluconeogenesis and ketone synthesis, which is sort of backdoor pathways to making energy. Again, just making it more efficient to release and use energy. And then it's going to promote synthesis of beta adrenergic receptors. And from our previous discussion in the autonomic nervous system, we know that beta adrenergic receptors are found in places like the heart, will speed up the contractility, speed up the heart rate and rhythm, and again, just overall improving and increasing our metabolic function. So we can see that on an individual level, look at all these different examples, the function of the thyroid hormone is global, right? It's vast throughout the body. Many different processes are sped up, and this is that calorigenic effect that thyroid hormone has. Now, I also want to connect this to diseases of the thyroid. So when you talk about Graves' disease, for example, which is hyperthyroidism, these patients have excess amounts of thyroid hormone being released. And so they typically will, first glance, looking at these patients, they will usually have a goiter, which is a swelling of the neck, which is just indicative of having just more hormone release, more hormone being produced and stored, which makes the thyroid gland get just larger. But also, if you look at them, they'll have the physical manifestations of the calorigenic effect. They'll have a lot of sweating. They'll have like sweaty palms. They'll be really nervous, really anxious. They'll almost be shaking. And they'll lose weight pretty quickly. And just overall signs of a very fast metabolism, which is a sign of excess thyroid hormone. Let's look at an example here of the thyroid hormone axis and just reiterate the different hormones here. So we have TRH, which is that thyroid releasing hormone. That is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary gland, again, by way of that portal circulation to release TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. And TSH is going to stimulate the thyroid gland to make T3 and T4. Now, the difference between T3 and T4 is kind of where they have their effect. So T3 is more active in the tissues. But if we start having excess levels of T3, the regulatory mechanism that is set in place is for T3 to be converted to T4. And so if there's a lot of T3 building up, that gets converted to T4. T4, however, is more involved in the negative feedback effect, which is great, right? If we have a lot of it, we want to start having that negative feedback loop to shut off the earlier hormones in the axis. So T3 is more active in the liver, right? Again, speeding up some of the gluconeogenesis, the oxidative phosphorylation, all of those mechanisms to release energy and just have higher metabolic function. Similarly with the kidneys, but all other body cells as well, just the overall calorigenic effect. And then T4 is, again, if we have higher levels of T3, it can be converted to T4. T4 is involved in the long negative feedback loop. So it can go all the way up and tell the hypothalamus to stop producing thyroid releasing hormone, which will shut off the axis. Or we also have the posterior pituitary, the anterior pituitary. The release of TSH here can also have a short negative feedback loop and also have a negative effect on thyroid releasing hormone. The posterior pituitary here, I've just drawn this in for context, but it has nothing to do with the thyroid axis. And I've listed the hormones released from this part of the gland. But remember, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary are separate in their function and their mechanisms as well. If you think back to the two different mechanisms we looked at, they're entirely separated in those regards. We can also think about parathyroid hormone. This is the 4 glands that are embedded in the thyroid gland posteriorly. So from a posterior perspective, we can see those four glands, and their release of calcitonin is to regulate blood calcium levels and basically decrease blood calcium levels by weight. I'm sorry, they're going to increase blood calcium levels, and it's not calcitonin. Calcitonin is released from the thyroid gland itself, but just different cells than the follicular cells. Parathyroid hormone is a different hormone released from the parathyroid glands, but both calcitonin and parathyroid hormone have an effect on blood calcium levels. Calcitonin will decrease blood calcium levels, and parathyroid hormone will actually increase those blood calcium levels. So they're kind of antagonistic hormones.